On a time when you talk about a story, and then people tend to think that way. They think that this is just a fairy tale that's made up, especially when you read the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. But the reality of Ruth is that this is historic. It did actually happen. And we have been all about trying to realize that in Ruth's story, her story, without her knowing it, really became part of God's story. God drew it up into his story. And so even before we began, all the way back at Christmas time, we started doing stories. And maybe even before I go on, I just want to take a moment. I don't know if there is Lindsay and Drew, are you in this service? They usually go to second. That was Lindsay. Lindsay is usually on the other side of the camera. So they came to me and to my wife. We met before Christmas, and they just had this incredible burden to start recording. And what Lindsay loves to do is work with people, helping them frame their stories and just how to make sense of your story, even when it's not done. But how to figure that out. And I think you just saw that perfectly. And so she's usually working on the content, helping people to pull it together as far as how do you shape and share your story. And then Drew is the guy behind the camera. So all of these stories that you have seen have been Lindsay and Drew working with so many of you, and they want to keep going in this. And we want to just build this huge library of stories. Because every one of us has a story. And it's when we realize how it is drawn into God's story, at the end, maybe you've seen it, it's like one piece of a billion piece puzzle that is really showing the greatness, the goodness, and the bigness of our God, the glory of our God. And so that's what it's been about. That's why you've been seeing these redemptive stories throughout this series, and we hope that you'll still continue to see them. We probably won't do one every week. That's a lot of work on these guys to try to pull this together every week. But I really wanted to thank them for all their incredible hard work on this. If you have your outline, please take it out. I just want to see a show of hands right now. How many people would say you have been here? This is our 5th week of Ruth. How many people have been here for all 5 weeks? You made it all? Really? That is amazing. Okay, so it looks like a little less than half of us. And so, I mean, that's impressive. I'm going to tell you, that's impressive because I know people have a lot of things going on, and there's often a lot of things that pull us away. As a matter of fact, this week, and I try to do this every time we do it, but this next week is one of the 2 times I go away for the week to be alone with the Lord, and then the leadership team joins me on the weekend, and we have our leadership team retreat. So I would ask, I covet right now your prayers. So while I'm away this week, if you would consider praying for me, that God would open his heart to me. I usually spend a big chunk of that time just going through my journals from the past and how God's been faithful to me, to my family, to this church. And then we talk, and then I start praying into just the future. And Lord, what do you see? What do you want as far as the future? And then leadership team comes and we really bring it together at that point. So if you have room, and I would ask that you might just make a little bit of room in your prayer time for me, I would really appreciate that this week. It really matters. It matters when we pray. So, all right, Ruth, chapter number 4, final chapter. I love this chapter because I am a horse trader. Not literally horses. I love the hunt. I love searching things out. I love wheeling and dealing, making deals on things. My wife hates it. When we go to a car lot, I go there just to have fun. That's the only reason. I mean, so we'll sit down with the dealer and he'll say, really, you're going to lose this car. We get it way down after hours and he'll say something like, you're going to lose this car for like $500. And I'll look at him and I'll say, you're going to lose this deal for $500? And my wife will say, Mark, just pay him $500. And I say to her, go get in the car and stay there. Let me do this. You know, I love the hunt. I love the working of a deal. And today you are going to see that like no other place, I think, in all of Scripture. Because somehow we think that that's wrong to do that, or it's wrong to be about legal matters and making things established. And I think we're going to see some other kinds of things. One of the great takeaways for me in this book, if you do have your outline out right now, one of the great things for me has been understanding and seeing how God works so uniquely. There's a couple of books that this happens in, but in this book, you will notice that there is not these big, gigantic, miraculous kinds of events that happen. D.A. Carson once wrote, and he talked about the two arms of God. And he said one of them that God uses to do things is an arm of miracles. He uses these crazy, wild miracles. He parts Red Seas. He heals people supernaturally. He goes through all these different, and we can just read through the scriptures, as I'm sure you have. And there's what we call his miraculous arm. And then the other side, that's what's visible. Then his other arm, Carson says, is the invisible arm of God, the invisible arm of God. And that's what he calls providence. That God works in the everyday events. It's the invisible, almost, if you will, arm of God. And in the book of Ruth, you have probably seen that. We've been calling your attention to it throughout this series. There are no great miracles. There is no fire that falls down from heaven. There are no angels with flaming swords or big messages. God doesn't speak in miraculous ways. As a matter of fact, you'll see very little of him even referring to him speaking. There's no big healing, supernatural healings. As a matter of fact, there's death. And so when we look at this book, what you end up seeing is a bunch of people just waking up every day, pulling their pants up, and going to work. They're trying to make a living. There is a widow and a couple of widows, and they were left without anything to take care of them. There was no kind of retirement package that their husbands left to them, and they were in the most desperate place of even being homeless and starving, perhaps, if they weren't careful. And we see God working in the providence throughout this book. What looks like the everyday natural ways of dealing with things. Ruth going out and trying to figure out what field should I go glean in. That was their welfare system of that day, picking up what's the leftovers. And it says that she just happened to go into Boaz's field. And we know that there is no just happens here. There is no coincidence, but this is God working through providence, just like in most of our lives. And I don't know if you've ever felt ripped off even. Can we say that on a Sunday morning as a Christian? I remember when I was in high school, I went to a very large church, and they often would have special speakers. And these people, when they came, they would speak of just miraculous things. I remember this one guy, he was a doctor, and he fell off a ladder, landed on his head, and he died, and he was officially pronounced dead at the site. And after all this, he came back to life. And I remember going home that day after church and saying, you know what, God, I read the Bible and I never see any of these things in my life. Why have I never seen some kind of radical miracle? And I was so angry, and I sat down in our den at the time, and I just sat there and I said, Lord, I'm not going to move here. I'm just not going to move until somehow you do something here, because why am I a second-class citizen? Why is it that I can't see you do something? I want to see a miracle, and my heart was just honest, crying out to the Lord. You know, I don't know that I said I want to die and come back, but I really wanted to see something, because I didn't understand the power of the providence of God, that God often moves. And throughout the life of Boaz and Ruth and Naomi, that's really all we see in this book. And it's most like, I think, our lives. Throughout scriptures, you'll see sometimes manna. This bread comes down to feed the Israelites supernaturally while they're out in the desert. But then sometimes, like in the book of Ruth, God doesn't rain down food for them. He gives them rain. And he waters their fields so that they can plant their crops and they can harvest and make their bread and do what they need to do. His hand of providence. Well, this is really the point when we're talking, and I don't know if you caught that in Lindsay's story, but she just talked about that feeling of having that same boring kind of that story, but God was always there as she looked back. And this is what I pray for you as a church, that as you do what I'm trying to do this week, and that's get away by myself and just take some time to look back, that you will see the hand of God in your life, in your marriage, if you have children there. And we're going to wrap this up with that God is working in the shadows of their stories in this passage, and ours. So I think if you were to ask Naomi and Ruth at this point, or even Boaz, what's God doing in your life right in the middle of the story? They'd probably look at you and say, what? What are you talking about? I don't know what God's doing. And that's where we all find ourselves. We're in the middle of our stories right now. And so we get the opportunity today to really look at the end of the story. And I learned some things as I just slowed down and went back and kind of were wrapping up some of this, because I think that's how most of us are. If things are going really well, we feel the hand of God. And if things are going really bad, we're crying out to God like, why? And it seems like so much of our lives can be wrapped up in what's happening right now. I look back at a passage that was all the way back in chapter 1. So if you have your Bibles, it was all the way back in chapter 1. I realized something that was wrong here. And it's really about where Naomi had gone away at the first time. And I'm gonna do a real quick summary here, a 3-minute summary. But before I do, this was this point where Naomi was gonna leave, and so they left everything, her husband and her 2 sons, and they go to this place called Moab. That'll make more sense if you don't understand it in a minute. But they go away, and the reason that they went away was because there was this great famine and they didn't have any food. But in chapter 1, verse 21, this just hit. She comes back to Bethlehem 10 years later after her husband had died and her 2 sons had died. Go to verse 20. And she says, don't call me. The women said, hey, Naomi. And she said, don't call me Naomi because that means pleasant. She said, call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has made me very bitter. Verse 21, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. I went away full, and now look it's empty. Now wait, think about this for a moment. When I really thought you went away full? Naomi, you left, and it was so bad that you hawked all your property. that you owned, all your fields, your house. You guys sold them probably for pennies on the dollar. And as a horse trade, that's a really great time to make a deal. If you're buying, and so you're just selling off all your stuff, because we'll find that today, that when they get back, their stuff is all gone. And so she had sold off all their stuff. It's a famine, you're starving. And it says, I went away full, and I came back empty. Now, I get it. I get why she said that. She said that simply because she thought she had it bad. And I would think I had it bad if my home were gone, all my property were in hock and foreclosed on, and I didn't know if I can put food on the table for my family. I'd say this is a tough time. But by the time she comes back, when she looks at that previous time, I won't ask for a show of hands on how many people relate to this, but when she thinks back to that previous time, after losing her husband and after losing her 2 sons, she says, oh, I went away full. No, that was full. I thought I had it bad. Anybody ever been there? I thought I had it bad back then. It was so terrible. But now, oh, if you knew now what I'm going through. I've talked to people that were going through a divorce, and they're just like, I got to get out of this thing. I got to get out of this. And they find themselves in this place where they separate, and they're out from that relationship because they thought it couldn't ever be worse. And they come back and they'll say something. And this has happened a number of times where I thought it was so bad, but now it's just so lonely. I am so alone. This is worse than it was before. I would have never understood that. You could see this in all kinds of life. And this is pretty much how she went away. And I just keep thinking about this account. I went away full. I had a husband and 2 sons, and I came back empty. Now, mental note. Ruth was probably standing right there. Huh? Can you see Ruth? You went away full, and you came back with nothing. Hello? I could have stayed, right? She doesn't say this because she's way too godly for this. But Ruth is standing there going, probably, I could have stayed home. I came here to just take care of you. And I came here because of your God. And I kind of gave everything. But what am I, chopped liver? I mean, really? I think this is going to come into play in just a little bit. All right. But for us to hit this last chapter, I want to get everybody up to speed. And this is the biggest challenge that I have, is running through 3 chapters very quickly. So I'm going to go to the Bible guys. Bible Project, 3 minutes, here we go, watch.
Chapter 1 opens with this line, in the days when the judges ruled. And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so the 2 of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions provision so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events.
All right. Woo! Got it? All right. Pick it up. Ruth chapter 4. And I love this because in your outline, let me just give you one other thing. Chapter 3, where it says catching up there, chapter 3 ends with an unconditional promise from Boaz to Ruth. He tells her, Ruth, I promise that you're going to be married. There is a kinsman redeemer. But now there's this problem because there's somebody even closer to you, and that's that rule of the family redeemer. It had to be the closest one because you could have a distant one and then a close one. But he says to her, you are going to be redeemed, Ruth, you and Naomi, because I will purchase it. But there's another one that's even closer. So she goes home basically to go a little deeper on this. And she basically tells her, look, I'm going to be married. I just don't know to who. Yikes. Can you imagine that? It's either going to be Boaz or this other one that we just found out is. Okay, so that's where we land. Now, a kinsman redeemer, they started to talk about that. There are 3 qualifications. I need you to know this. This is going to become so important in this chapter. 3 qualifications to be a kinsman redeemer. 1, you have to be a family, kin. You have to be kin, okay? You have to be family. You have to be related in some way, distant or close. 2, you have to have the means to pay off the debt. Now this you have to understand. If this stage were my property, and it had been in my family, I can never lose true ownership of this property. What happens is even if I hawk it, even if I go into debt and I sell it, it's not selling like we do today. It's more like a lease. And so if somebody bought it, it's still mine. And what could happen is if I can pay it back, I get my property back. If I can't pay it back, but my kinsman redeemer can, he can buy it back for me, and then it goes back to me. Also, there's this thing called the year of Jubilee, about every 50 years, and it goes back at that time to the original owners. This was the way God took care of the families, and he took care of people in Israel. And so this is kind of what would happen with it. Now, if a woman like Ruth went to her kinsman redeemer and said, will you redeem me? And that's what she did with Boaz. Remember, she pulled his robe off over his feet. She laid at his feet and she said, cover me with your wing, cover me. It wasn't a marriage proposal. What she was saying to him is, I need a redeemer. If you would have me, I would love to be your wife. She really put it out there to him this last week. We talked about this. And so Boaz, that's when he gives her that statement. And what you would do is, if you did, you would cover, and that's what he did. But if you said you were the kinsman, and by the way, the third part, that third qualification is you have to be willing to do it if you're the guy. You can have the money, you can be the family, but if you're not willing, you don't have to. But you're known as a dirtbag, okay? And you're actually known, this is the true actual word, is the man with one sandal. The man with one, now you're going, what in the world? Okay, now some of this, you're gonna have to stay with me, because this is crazy cultural stuff. But what would happen is if a woman went to him and he said, no, I'm out, I don't wanna do it, she would take his sandal, so he would only have one sandal, and she would spit in his face. If you think I'm lying, check out Deuteronomy chapter 25. It's in the Bible. So she would spit in his face, and she would take his sandal, and he would be known as the guy with one sandal. Translation, dirtbag. Okay, so this is going to also come into play as we dive into this. By the way, if you think that is so bizarre, how many of you might remember back in the year 2008, President at that time, George W. Bush, was in the Middle East, and he was doing a press conference, and one of the reporters, what did they do? Anybody remember? He took off and he threw his shoe. That guy got thrown in jail for, well, how many years was it? A year. He was thrown in prison for a year because in that culture, that was the ultimate sign of disrespect, that you would take your, so it's still, there. We don't understand it, but I just thought somebody threw their shoe at him. I thought, that was crazy. But it had more meaning than that. So keep that in mind. Okay, so there's all your background, your cultural stuff. It keeps going. Here we go. Love finds a way. It always finds a way. And now we are looking at the problem of being in second position. And any negotiator knows you don't want to be in second position. You want to be in first position when you're trying to make a deal with somebody. And so we see chapter 4, verse 1, Boaz went to the gate of the town and sat down there. Now that would be just really easy to keep reading, just like it was a place. He went to the big rock and he sat down. No, the gate of the city is where all the governance often happened. It was the city council, they met there. The gate of the city, Fletch, this is called the Lion's Gate in Jerusalem. Often, depending on how big the city is, you would have a double gate system like this. You can't really see it probably from where you are, but the inside gates are open, and they would have two sets of gates, an outer gate and an inner gate. And the person might come in times of war, and they would come in, they'd close the big gates, and then they'd close the other gates, and they're inside, and people are up on top with spears and with oil that they could pour out on them, and they say, state your business, what are you doing here? And some things would happen like that. Other times, it's just where the elders would hang out and all the big decisions were made. I could take you back to a number of places. Absalom, when he took the kingdom from David, every day he went to the city gates and he let people off their debts so that they would love him more than his father. Here's another rendition. This is kind of a drawing of it, because often in the city gates they could put things up like tents, and then it would be there that they would go. This makes us wonder a little bit about Boaz. Is he just this guy? Or, well, let's keep reading. You tell me. It says, so he sat down at the city gates. Soon, the family redeemer Boaz had spoken about came by. He came by. Just coincidence. Isn't that the craziest thing? He sits down and let me just ask, miracle? Providence? Providence. Good, you're getting it. Okay, so in God's providence, this comes over. Now, this is also really interesting because in the original writings, he says to this guy, friend, but here's the reality. The person who recorded Ruth would not put his name in there. He wouldn't put his name because he was not going to give this guy the credit of having his name. So in Hebrew, there is actually a word, and it means Mr. So-and-so, or what's his face. Mr. What's his face. I mean, they never, ever tell us who this guy, this closer redeemer, family redeemer is. So this guy just happens to come by, and Boaz said, come over here and sit down. So he went over and sat down. Okay. Then Boaz took 10 men of the town's elders and said, sit here, and they sat down. Now, the Bible says if you're going to establish something, you need 2 or 3 witnesses. He gets 10. And he says, sit down. And they all sit down. He sees this guy, sit down. And he said, kind of lets you somewhat wonder if he had a little bit of juice. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I think many commentators will say they almost believe he might have been the mayor of Bethlehem. We don't know. But when he said sit down, they sat down, and he got 10 instead of 2 or 3. He said, I want 10 of you here. And he sits them down, and you're going to see one of the craziest negotiations. And he said to the Redeemer, this Boaz said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has returned from the territory of Moab, is selling the portion of the field belonged to our brother Elimelech. That was her original husband who died. Verse 4. I thought that I should inform you. Buy it back in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you want to redeem it, do it. But if you do not want to redeem it, tell me so that I will know, because there isn't anyone other than you to redeem it, meaning there's no one closer than you to redeem it. Oh, and can't you see this guy? Talk about a horse trade. I love this guy. He goes, yeah, I may be interested. I mean, I don't know, but I don't know. Maybe I'd pick it up myself. No big deal. Just a piece of property here, and I'll redeem it myself. You know, I'm next after you. And then the guy, Mr. What's-his-face, says, I want it. I want it. What do you think Boaz's stomach is doing at that moment? Oh, now I'm sure he is not showing it. This guy's got you do not want to play poker with Boaz. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. So he just sits there. He's like, the guy says, what's his face says, I want to redeem it, he answered. And then verse 5, Boaz said, well, okay, on the day you buy the field from Naomi, you will acquire Ruth the Moabitess. He never calls her a Moabite. That was a bad thing. But remember, the night before, she's at his feet. He gives her 80 pounds of barley harvest, and he says, Ruth, go home, stay there, go home. I don't want you here. Just go home. I'm going to take care of this. I'm not going to rest until this thing is done. So now he is at the city gates, and he happens to pitch it out there. By the way, she's a Moabite. We don't like Moabites. They are our enemies. They have these foreign gods. But he just simply knows he's just going to place it out. Yeah, Ruth the Moabite, she comes with the deal. And the wife of the deceased man to perpetuate the man's name on his property. Now, I want you to imagine this. This is the way it might play, okay? Notice I'm not standing near my Bible. I'm away from it. This is Mark. But I'm thinking to myself, this is what happens. So he goes home, Mr. What's-his-face goes home that night, and he says, honey, you're not going to believe this. a deal came up that we could buy this property for like maybe 30 cents on the dollar. It's this really great field. And she's like, wow, like you can redeem this, kinsman. Yeah. And okay, so you want to do it? It sounds like just a really awesome thing. By the way, it also comes with another woman. So there's going to be another woman in our house, and I need to help her have a bunch of babies. So this is because we got to perpetuate her name, and she's a Moabite. Can you see that? She's a whatabite? She's a Moabite. Oh, and it doesn't end there. She's going to bring her crusty mother-in-law, who's really bitter. She's going to live with us too. It's going to be great. I just love the way Boaz just keeps laying it out there, man. Verse 6, the Redeemer, the first guy, so-and-so, what's his face, replied. He replies to him. So he didn't actually run home, but I mean, this is going through his mind. He replies, I can't redeem it myself, or I will ruin my own inheritance. You know what he's doing? This is all about penciling it out. Because one of the things is, if he redeems it, if he redeems Ruth, and she has children, he's helping her. He's buying out of his pocket her property, but that doesn't go to his family over here. That goes to her. And so he's looking at this thing and he's trying to pencil it out, man. He's sharpening his pencil and he's like, okay, this just isn't working out. I know what my wife's going to say when this is just a tough situation. And really, when it comes down to it, what Ruth is to him is a problem. She's a problem to him. And to Boaz, she's the dream of his life. She is what he maybe even gave up on ever having. And he's looking at, and you see this different. One, it's a blessing, and one, it's kind of a curse here. And this guy is really just trying to figure it out. And he says, oh, if I do that, I'm going to wreck my own inheritance. Boaz, all of his life, he's been a rich businessman, and he's just blessed people. Remember, he's just given his money out to people. He cares about people. By the way, I also find it fascinating, sidebar, just way over here, that when Boaz makes the deal, he says, listen, if you don't buy this thing back, if you don't do it, I will. Did you catch that? What he was saying is, you're not going to be the guy with one sandal, so don't worry about that. You're not going to be the dirtbag, Mr. What's-His-Face. I will do it. She'll be taken care of. You're off the hook. He's given this guy every back door here to get out of this deal. I love it. You know, we talked about people, sometimes we see them as scenery or machinery. Sometimes we see them as people, but this guy saw Ruth as a problem. She was a problem, not a blessing. She has a bunch of kids. I'm going to give half my estate to these half-breeds, and man, such a different heart of Boaz that you have to understand. Verse 7, and at an earlier period, now this is parenthetical little statement of how it worked. At an earlier period in Israel, a man removed his sandal and he gave it to the other party in order to make any matter legally binding concerning the right of redemption in exchange of property. This was the method of legally binding a transaction in Israel. Verse 8, so the Redeemer, Mr. What's-His-Face, removed his sandal and said to Boaz, buy back the property, but there's no spit happening, there's no bad connotation. Here it is, I make this deal with you. Now, let's keep going. Verse 9, I'm going to pick it up here. And Boaz said to all the elders that were sitting there at Peel, you are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything, underline, everything that belonged to Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, Mahlon's wife, as my wife, to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property so that his property would remain, that all of that would still take place, so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. The legal documents. You are witnesses today. You see, it was about your name. And all these people, verse 11, who were at the city gate, including the elders, said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah. What? Rachel and Leah, they were the ones, read it, who together built the house of Israel. They were some of the most esteemed women. May you be powerful in Ephrath, and your name, catch that, and your name, Boaz, may your name be well known in Bethlehem. May your house become like the house of Perez, the son of Tamar, bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman. And I love that, because here's the deal. Ready? Mr. What's-His-Face, all he wanted to do, he's working his stuff, man. He is not doing anything except from his own angle. And he's trying to just make a name. He doesn't even have a name. And the name of Boaz, they are saying, let that live on. He wouldn't even know it. Do you know what his great-great-grandson, he was this guy, you may have heard of him. His name was Solomon. And he would build the first temple in Israel. And there were two huge pillars in the middle of this temple, and he named them. Guess what one of their names was? Boaz. Strength. That's what it means. A pillar. And Boaz's name will live on. Boaz has no idea of this. Mr. What's-His-Face, you're gone. Because all you did was you lived for yourself. That's all you ever did. It wasn't about anybody else except what penciled out to you. And so, verse 13, Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. What started with a funeral and a famine now ends with this wedding. Well, it even ends, it keeps going. So he took his wife and he slept with her. We all know what that, chicka bow bow. Okay, it's not, okay. They didn't go to sleep, well, they went to, they had sex. I'm sorry, really. And then answer me this. So he slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her, and she gave birth to a son. Miraculous or providence? Providence. Unless somebody says it depends on how old he was. We don't know. It could have been miraculous, I suppose, but we don't know that. Probably providence. And the women, now catch this. Naomi, remember, is the older mother-in-law who had become bitter. Verse 14, and the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a family name, a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel. He, the Redeemer, will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, now this is what grabbed me. Indeed, your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. There's Ruth that was standing there last time. Naomi said, I got nothing. Now, all of her friends have said, Ruth is better than 7 Jewish sons. Now, what you don't probably fully understand is that 7 is the number of completion. 7 is the number of perfection. To say 7 sons, the sons were, as you grew old, they were going to protect you. Your sons were going to provide for you. 7 is the number, that's the complete perfect picture. Do you know what they were saying? Who would have figured this? They are redefining what real success is. They're saying, no, you know what? 7 sons is not the definition of success. This woman, who would have figured that? And when you think back on Ruth, what did she have when she came to Naomi? So her husband dies. Remember, they're on their way back to Bethlehem. And Naomi says, you two, Orpah, you and Ruth, go home. Orpah does, but Ruth doesn't. Who does that? Have you ever thought of this? When an immigrant is leaving their country, that's really got to be hard. I've never had to do it. But when you're leaving your country and you're going to another place, that is a lot of risk. And the reason you're leaving this and going here is because at least of a promise, a hope of something better, right? I hope for something better that's there. Ruth didn't have that. Ruth was at home. That was her home. And Naomi said, go back, marry somebody, have children. It's a good, go back. And because she makes this commitment, not only to to Naomi, she makes a commitment to God. What Ruth did on that day when she said, I will not leave you, your people shall be my people, and your God, Yahweh, will be my God. She came up, and when she came to God, she came with nothing in her hands. She didn't come with this perfect picture. Okay, God, I'm coming to you, but I'd like to have 7 sons. I don't know how you're going to do that, but that's my little definition of the way it's supposed to play. Who would have ever figured it would have gone this way? All Ruth did is she came and she put herself in the hands of God. And then, verse 16, Naomi, she has this little babe. She's given birth to him. And 16, and Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became his nanny. And the neighbor women said, a son has been born to Naomi. Now that's just what they're laughing about. And they named him Obed. Obed means servant. It also has a secondary meaning of worshiper, a servant worshiper. And he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Yeah, King David. And then it goes into a genealogy. And a genealogy just simply means this. It means the story doesn't end there. And this story will continue, and it will continue. And I think if you were to ask Ruth or Naomi or Boaz or any of them, what's God doing? None of them would know. And if I asked you today, exactly lay it out for me, what is God doing in your life? Could we just be honest enough to say, I really don't know. I'm in the middle of my story. It's a horrible time to try to figure your entire existence out and where you're going to land. You don't know. And I don't know. But we can look back just like they did, and I love this. And I started wondering, how far do I live out? How far do I pray out? We pray for our kids, and then they had children, and we were grandparents, and then you know what? We started praying for our grandkids. Have we ever prayed for our great-grandkids or our great-great-great-grandkids? See, this is how much we live in this moment. I know some of you are praying. You have kids that are teenagers, and you're praying for their spouses already, and you're doing something. But man, oh man, how far do we live out? Now, this week, if you're in a life group, you picked a good week to be in a life group. Because what we're going to do is we're not going to go way back over all of this. We're going to go forward. And what I've done is I played Boaz this week. I left a whole bunch out there for you to glean. And your life group leaders are going to help you go through this, and we are going to look way ahead into this story, but I'm not going to wreck it. It's kind of on the other side. I feel like I want to just stop here today. And when we look at this, and we can go through that whole deal, but you get to the end, and I just love verse 21. And Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And that is the story of Ruth. I wonder what heaven would have been like the day that Boaz and Ruth got there and said, "What? All the way through our line." See, you don't have any idea how big your cup is, and you have no idea what God wants to do with it and with you. Would you pray with me? I'm going to ask the band to come on up. Lord, I ask that today, what we could do is that we could celebrate, Lord. You are, as one great preacher, but you are our great Boaz, Lord. You are our Boaz. You are our kinsman redeemer. In relation, Jesus, you're our brother. Father, you are our Father that we just sang about earlier. Jesus, you had the means to pay off our debt and to buy us out of slavery. And the best part is that you were willing to do it, Lord. You were willing to do it. And when we go to the table, we remember that. And so, Lord, we enter this time right now. We remember that we could have never seen this coming. But we've got this great story. We kind of live it. It feels like Naomi. I thought it couldn't get any worse, but it's gotten worse. And maybe it's worse for you today. Would you take the words of this sacred book, and would you realize that your final chapter has not been written? Your children's final chapter has not been written. Even when we're gone, we don't know what God wants to do with the quiet life of Boaz just working his field, of Ruth just gleaning and clinging on to the Lord. I invite you today to remember this as you go to the table. And take a little piece of bread if you're a believer today, and take a cup, and then we'll take them together in just a moment when everybody has been served.